Matt. My team is Esteban, Jillian, and Brian, and they'll be coming and joining me throughout this presentation about zero-emission vehicles in California and policy options to help accelerate adoption throughout the state. So why do we want to focus on ZEVs? Well, California's transportation sector accounts for 37% of its greenhouse gas emissions. And of this 37%, 71% comes from light-duty vehicles. And the way to think about light-duty vehicles is anything from a subcompact, like Geo Metro or smaller, all the way up to a Ford F-150 or a comparable type vehicle. So if you multiply those two numbers together, you have the opportunity to replace 26% of greenhouse gas emissions in California today. But what is a ZEV? So from left to right, a zero-emission vehicle is a battery electric vehicle, such as the Tesla on the left, a fuel cell electric vehicle, such as the Toyota Mirai in the middle, and then a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, such as the Chevy Volt on the left, or your right, excuse me. But so there's this broad scope of low-emission vehicles. We're all pretty familiar with the Toyota Prius. Well, I'm going to take you to the bottom of this chart first, and we'll work our way up. Now, the Toyota Prius is an example of a hybrid electric vehicle. It's not a ZEV, but it does have greatly increased fuel economy and positive effects on air pollution throughout the transportation sector. As we move up this chart, you're sort of getting a little bit more technologically advanced. Plug-in hybrids are sort of to bridge the gap between battery electric vehicles and hybrid electric vehicles to sort of make the technology step as we progress towards battery technology and overall drivetrains for battery electric vehicles. And what they are is it's an electric motor with an onboard internal combustion engine that can provide energy to that electric motor to keep it going. And then a battery electric vehicle, a lot of us are familiar with the Tesla. There's also things coming online such as the Chevy Bolt. The Nissan Leaf has been on the market for quite a while. And these are plugged into the wall to get their energy, and then they're driven off that electricity. And finally, fuel cell vehicles. A fuel cell vehicle is one that has a onboard compressed hydrogen system, and it uses that compressed hydrogen, it converts it into energy, and propels the vehicle from there. So our agenda today, I've already given you the introduction. Next I'm going to follow up with the background. Brian's going to hit you with the methodology and the results. And then Jillian and Esteban are coming in and give us some policy recommendations about how we can address this problem. And then I'll come in and wrap it up with a conclusion. So Executive Order B16-2012, introduced in 2012, says exactly this. There will be over 1.5 million zero-emission vehicles in California by 2025. The bigger picture here, California is very interested, as evidenced by these three pieces of legislation here, AB 32, SB 1078, also known as the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and SB 350, in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. ZEVs are a way to help the state achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions. Specifically to vehicles and zero-emission vehicles, there are some key pieces of legislation, to include the Cash Vehicle Rebate Program, which provides up to $5,000 towards the purchase of a new zero-emission vehicle. There's HOV lane access, which provides consumers time-saving incentives if they acquire a new zero-emission vehicle. And this used to be applied to hybrid electric vehicles. About 10 years ago, you would see similar stickers on the bumpers of Priuses that you kind of see now on Nissan Leafs and Teslas and things like that. And then finally, the Alternative Fuels Vehicle and Technology Program, implemented in AB 118, provides up to $100 million annually towards research for zero-emission vehicles and alternative fuels as a way to reduce the state's greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. But with all these great things, there are some significant barriers to zero-emission vehicle adoption right now. Prime amongst them is the upfront cost. Zero-emission vehicles are just more expensive than their internal combustion engine-driven counterparts. Additionally, a lot of consumers have range anxiety with battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicles. And what I mean by that is these vehicles are technology constrained at present. Most of them go about 100 miles. The top of the class, which is also extremely expensive, can go about 300 miles. So then this sort of ties into the next bullet, which is infrastructure limitations. If you're getting low on gas and you're driving around, you can just go to a gas station and fill up. If you're in a battery electric vehicle, this isn't really an option for you because the infrastructure just isn't there, and you risk being stranded. So a lot of people are concerned about the range of their battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicles. And then finally, producers right now, since the technology is a little bit behind where society wants it to be, producers aren't seeing the marginal profits that they would like to see to incentivize them to invest in advertising and other sorts of developments with regards to zero-emission vehicles. And also, if you notice the vehicle on this slide, it's pretty aesthetically unattractive. However, there are some very aesthetically pleasing zero-emission vehicles out there. This is an example of a supercar called the Fisker Karma, which qualifies as a zero-emission vehicle. Not a lot of consumers know about this. In fact, according to one research institution, 2/3 of Californians are unaware of ZEVs and the benefits that they can offer. So what this gives us is an opportunity to generate consumer excitement and educate consumers to build to their knowledge base with regards to zero-emission vehicles. Which brings us kind of to our research questions. Now, we had 2 research questions throughout our project. The first one is, will there be 1.5 million zero-emission vehicles on the road by 2025? And the second one, how can we accelerate ZEV adoption, regardless of whether or not we have 1.5 million vehicles? And I'm going to turn it over to Brian, and he's going to discuss our methodology and results.
Great, thanks, Matt. Okay, so as Matt said, what I'd like to do right now is run through the methodology and results that we used to answer both of our research questions. So as a refresher, our first research question, will California have 1.5 million ZEVs on the road by 2025? To answer this question, we conducted a literature review, and what we were looking for was to find general adoption trends throughout the state of California. Our second research question, how can we accelerate ZEV adoption? We tried to answer this using expert interviews. So we conducted a series of interviews, and through those interviews tried to identify accelerators and other ways we could actually get more ZEVs on the road. We used the results of those interviews to try to generate policy ideas, which we'll present at the end of the presentation. So we'll start off with looking at research question 1, whether California is on track to meet 1.5 million ZEVs on the road by 2025. So to answer this question, we conducted a literature review. We considered a series of different growth models. So the 2 at the top, the consumer choice model and the diffusion model, we addressed these models by looking at the literature around these kinds of models. And then the other 2, we both built our own model and used existing literature for that. So I'll just run through these models in order, and we could talk about kind of what each one output. So starting with the consumer choice model, the way that this particular model works is it takes all the different inputs that one might consider when they're trying to purchase a ZEV and puts those all into one model, and they use that to try to estimate how many consumers are actually willing to buy a zero-emission vehicle over a course of time. So they'll take all these inputs in and run a series of models, and they'll output the results and hopefully try to figure out, use that to estimate how many ZEVs they'd expect to see each year. The results of this from the literature review are unfortunately a little bit limited. So the literature that we found was only really looking at plug-in hybrids, which are just a subset of zero-emission vehicles. And on top of that, the literature that exists today really only looks at the entire United States and not California in particular. So even though we had those kinds of constraints when we were looking at the literature, overall the results were fairly promising for overall ZEV growth. We saw trends from anywhere between 1% of all sales in the US by 2025 to 18% of all sales in the US by 2025 being plug-in hybrids alone, which, as I said, is just a subset of zero-emission vehicles. So we also considered a diffusion model. The way the diffusion model works is it attempts to map out, again, over a set of time, how quickly or slowly a given technology will actually diffuse into the market it's trying to enter. The results, again, for this through the literature were somewhat limited. They only looked at plug-in hybrids, just like the consumer choice model, and also only looked at the United States. However, the results of this were also fairly promising. The results that we found for this particular model had to do with sales, and we found that sales in 2025 seemed to range throughout the United States between an estimation of 85,000 to over 2 million. And again, that's just for plug-in hybrids alone. So results are fairly promising. I should also mention here that California currently is about 40% of the entire ZEV market in the US, so take about half of these results and it looks fairly good for California. And these models do show a general upward trend of zero-emission vehicle growth throughout the US. So the next model we want to consider was using hybrid electric vehicle growth as a surrogate for zero-emission vehicle growth. So hybrid electric vehicles entered the market in 1999, which gives us about 15 years of year-over-year growth of hybrid electric vehicles. We took the growth of hybrid electric vehicles in California, and then we mapped that on and used that to project the growth of zero-emission vehicles in California. And the reason that we decided this would be a fair estimator or a fair surrogate is because a lot of the reasons the early adopters bought hybrid electric vehicles are the same reason that people buy zero-emission vehicles today. They're better for the environment, they reduce the amount that you're having to spend on gas every month, it reduces dependence on oil, and a whole host of other factors make it a really attractive model and a really good surrogate for zero-emission vehicles. We'll show the results of that in just one second here. Finally, we also just want to conduct a simple growth rate analysis. What we want to know is, given the goal of 1.5 million ZEVs, what does the growth rate have to be year over year to actually achieve that goal? So moving into our actual results, again, answering this first question here. So where are we right now? we're right here in 2015 at about 150,000 vehicles on the road in California. The top line that we see here, that's using the hybrid electric vehicle year-over-year growth rate as a surrogate for ZEV growth rate. And we can see this is very favorable for trying to reach the 1.5 million target. In fact, it eclipses it around 2022 or 2023. So again, quite promising. The compound annual growth rate, the smooth line that you see below it, should end at about 1.5 million because that's what we entered into the model. We would need a growth rate of about 11.9% year-over-year to actually attain this target, which up until 2014 is actually pretty good because every year California's had greater growth than 11.9%. So the question that still remains here, after looking at all these models, is what is the actual trajectory in California? Is it following the hybrid electric vehicle model? And if so, that's a really good sign because California is going to eclipse its target. If it's following the compound annual growth rate model, that's still a good sign because we'll reach the target of 1.5 million. Or is there potential where the sales are actually about to flatline and we won't see the kind of growth that we anticipate? And this is potentially the case, which is why we want to introduce here the Gartner hype cycle. So what the Gartner hype cycle suggests is that after a period of really heightened expectations and a lot of excitement about a particular product, these expectations actually decrease and decline. And so you get all these early adopters that are excited and interested in the market, then all of a sudden they end up, you lose all these you lose all the excitement and people are no longer as interested in purchasing zero-emission vehicles. And this may or may not be occurring in California right now. In 2014, overall sales were about 60,000 zero-emission vehicles. In 2015, up through September, overall sales were 45,000. So if we project that out to all the way through 2015, that comes out to also 60,000 vehicles. So we see actually no growth between 2014 and 2015. So this is a big point of concern, which is why we then want to launch to our second research question, which is regardless of what the actual growth is, and it does appear that there is more growth overall in California, the big question is how can we continue to accelerate that growth to make sure we don't end up getting in this stagnated area that we see right here. So that'll move on to the second research question, which is how can we accelerate zero-emission vehicle growth in California? So to answer this, we conducted a series of expert interviews. And we wanted to talk to people in 4 different sectors, and government was one big sector, obviously, and then we also wanted to talk to the manufacturers, people that actually make and have to sell these vehicles. We also want to make sure to talk to researchers and people that are really well-versed in the subject of ZEVs. And then, of course, there were some people that we couldn't quite classify, but were still acutely interested in the ZEV problem. So our team conducted a total of 19 interviews, and that reached 25 different individuals. The interviews would span between a half an hour to up to 2 hours. So we allowed the interviewees to really talk about their particular area of expertise. We didn't hand them a survey and have them say one thing or another thing or really answer all the questions we wanted to have them answer, but instead we allowed them to really talk about what they knew best. But what we did try to ask every single interviewee is, would a given accelerator that they list increase ZEV demand in California? We were really trying to gather what accelerators were out there and what interviewees thought would be the most effective accelerators. So we can move on to our results right here. This table indicates the results of all the interviews that we conducted, and we've ranked them. So on the top are the interviews, or are the accelerators that were most recommended by our interviewees, and at the bottom are the ones that are least recommended by our interviewees. So we can see overall there's some that are really popular, and it kind of scales down to there's one suggested, for example, that only got one recommendation. But we noticed out of all of these different accelerators kind of a general trend, and we were able to actually bucket these into 3 more easy to understand buckets. So one big accelerator that was presented was to offer incentives. So we can see here this had a large number of people suggesting and recommending this accelerator. This could range from anything for cost incentives, trying to reduce the upfront cost of the vehicle, to actually time-saving incentives too, like the HOV line that Matt mentioned earlier. A second big area, another big way to target acceleration, was to look at expanding the charging infrastructure and helping out zero-emission vehicles have an expanded charging infrastructure. And then finally, although there weren't a lot of subcategories to this, a lot of people, this is actually the second most recommended accelerator, suggested that we have to increase consumer awareness, get more people interested in ZEVs. So with that, I'll be happy to turn over to Jillian, and she's going to talk about some of the policies to help address these particular accelerators that were identified.
Thank you, Brian. It's my job to introduce the first 2 policies of our 4 policy recommendation. So the number 1 driver of market growth in the US for ZEVs are incentives. And we looked at 3 consumer incentives, including financial, business, which is a 100% first-year depreciation of commercial ZEVs, and time-saving incentives. So let's start with financial, because as a California resident, there is $14,000 available. There's a federal tax credit, there's a rebate program, and then there's CAP. And CAP is the Consumer Assistance Program, which offers $1,500 to replace smog test vehicles which fail the smog test. Now we want to offer an extension to the CAP program. This involves targeting mid to low income earners by giving them an additional $1,500 and offering them that money to turn in a failed smog test vehicle and acquire a zero-emission vehicle. Now the reason for this is our research showed that there's a big gap between the people who own a zero-emission vehicle and those that purchase an ICE, an internal combustion engine vehicle, and the gap is in their income. So what we are doing is we are opening a new market to new consumers, the low to mid-income earners. But what if you could take that $14,000 straight to the dealer today? You didn't have to fill out those tax credit forms and those rebate forms. Now we have support for this policy from the President down to the people who offer the rebate programs. This is a point of sale cash discount on the zero-emission vehicle that you purchase. And this is proven time and time again to be one of the biggest drivers of consumption. The second consumer incentive we're offering is targeting businesses. Now this, for a business purchase, if you were able to 100% depreciate the asset in the first year of service, you would attract a lot more consumers of ZEVs. Currently, your first year limit is $11,160, and this is offered by the IRS. So we acknowledge that this is a federal issue, and the California Franchise Tax Board would have to work directly with the IRS to bring a program like this into commission. So our recommendation is that businesses are able to 100% depreciate that asset in the first year of service. And in the past decade, the IRS have offered 6 bonus depreciation schedules, which have been used as economic stimulus, and they've resulted in the consumption of more assets, more real estate, and more vehicles within the businesses. Our research showed that we have strong business earnings, so we have strong profits that businesses could take advantage of this. We actually have an aging commercial fleet out there. The third incentive is around time saving, and what we found was that 90% of LA-based Nissan Leaf drivers bought it to access the HOV lane. So the simple recommendation is to continue the HOV sticker program, but also to consider the increase of HOV lanes within the state capital works programs, especially on high commuter routes and high traffic routes. The second policy that we'd like to introduce is to transform fleets. Can you remember the last time you rode in a Toyota Prius? And for me, it's via Uber every week. But what about the first time you rode in a battery electric vehicle? 100%. Transforming the fleet is simply about normalizing this experience for everyday commuters. Take the Department of General Services, for example. They have 5,000 vehicles which could be converted from an internal combustion engine to a zero-emission vehicle. Now that's 18% of their fleet, and they have an executive order to actually transform 25% of their fleet. This is thousands of employees who will have the opportunity to ride in a zero-emission vehicle and have conversations about the use of those vehicles and implementing them into our everyday lives. So the policy to transform fleets is about making the consumers who are most able to bring ZEVs into existence responsible for that acquisition. Transforming the fleet to normalise the experience for everyone. So not just should it be the responsibility of the Department of General Services, but we should also introduce that to local government. We should incentivise our commercial fleets, like our Ubers and our Lyfts, through depreciation schedules to use ZEVs. And finally, we need to simplify the contracting and financing of ZEV purchases. That sums up the first 2 policy recommendations. So I'll hand on to Esteban to introduce the third and fourth policy recommendations.
Thank you, Jillian. Our third policy recommendation is to establish infrastructure. One thing we wanted to do to understand the magnitude of the change that we could be asking consumers and society in general to make was to actually look at the dominant technologies in terms of zero-emission vehicles. The 2 dominant, as we have introduced earlier, are fuel cell vehicles and electric vehicles. Well, it turns out that if society voted for a hydrogen world, it would not be very different from a gasoline world in terms of what consumers would be doing every day. They could drive up to a hydrogen station, they would refuel within a few minutes, and then they would be able to drive around for a few days before they had to refuel again. Now, it turns out that the dominant technology, which is electric vehicles, requires different infrastructure solutions. Because, first of all, it takes usually hours to fully recharge an electric vehicle. And then you can only drive for a day or two if you are doing your daily commute before you have to recharge again. Now, that actually is a problem if you don't have your own parking space or an allocated place for you to actually charge for hours. And it turns out that a third of Californians don't live in a place where they have their own assigned parking space to do this. This implies that we almost have to have a one-to-one access to a charging station for a number of hours every day or every other day if we really want mass adoption of zero-emission vehicles. Therefore, our recommendation is to look at existing legislation that can help us deal with that. On the one hand, AB 802, for instance, has already introduced a score mechanism to determine how efficient buildings are in terms of energy use. We suggest that this score mechanism could be modified so that it also includes the availability of charging infrastructure in order to motivate developers to install these in existing buildings as well as in future buildings. And we also suggest that we use current funding by the state of California, as Matt suggested, that is already being used for alternative fuel development, and with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So some of this money could be used to co-fund charging stations wherever utilities or developers cannot do so themselves. Our fourth policy recommendation is to generate awareness and excitement. That really means we all have to become aware of what it is. We want the government and industry to work together to spread the word. And this has been done in the past. We have the examples of real California cheese, smoking cessation, and currently the Stanford School of Business is working to contribute to the water campaign. Now, the reason for government and industry to work together is because, first of all, we believe that the access to zero-emission vehicles, while it may be a private choice, it provides a public good. That means that there is an interest both in government and the private sector to stimulate the purchase of zero-emission vehicles. So the joint effort could set the platform for the generic set of benefits that we want to see, and then individual manufacturers can have their own ads saying, oh, well, my particular model in addition does this, this other model in particular does that as well. Therefore, our recommendation here is to launch a statewide public-private awareness campaign. I will turn it over now to Matt, who's going to summarize it for us.
Thanks. All right, so we're already at our conclusion. We talked about the ZEV mandate. It's a mandate to help reduce pollution statewide. However, there's some barriers to adoption. Producers and consumers alike are not fully incentivized at present to adopt these vehicles based on technology constraints and the confluence of other factors. We did have our 2 research questions to help identify how we can increase adoption throughout the state. The first one was, will there be 1.5 million ZEVs on the road by 2025? And then the second one was, regardless, if there's 500,000 or if there's 10 million, it's to California's benefit to have more ZEVs on the road because it reduces greenhouse gas emissions statewide. So how do we make that happen? And then we got into our solution, which is our policy recommendations in terms of incentives, whether they be financial or time, whether they be transforming fleets, either government fleets or commercial fleets, infrastructure changes to increase either fuel cell or battery electric vehicle charging throughout the state, and then finally a public-private awareness campaign to change the narrative that surrounds zero-emission vehicles right now and make people aware of the opportunity that exists with zero-emission vehicles in terms of not only their performance, but also their benefit to society as a whole. That concludes our presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions at this point in time.
Thank you. do you guys want to, do you want to start off to see if there's anyone who's online watching?
There are 5 participants online, GM, Ford, and Sue is online. Okay,
Okay,
so you can actually put the volume, is that right, Brian?
Okay, yeah. If you just hit the volume button, that should work. Oh, someone streaming their TV. Okay.
We can
Alright.
take questions via.
Other questions?
Yeah.
You guys just call up people.
Bruce?
Yeah.
Well, I had to come give you a hard time. So, actually, unfortunately, I can't give you a hard time. I thought it was a good presentation when Lonnie and I heard the small part of it that you did for our class, and you've grown it in very interesting ways. This is a good group. The question I had is simply this flattening out thing. I'm wondering whether anybody's really seriously looked at that in light of some of the ideas that you have. In other words, how much of it is that economic conditions, how much of it is that, you know, as you say, the first adopters might have been people that had a lot of income and now you want to incentivize others, but how much of it is also the infrastructure problem, how much of it is that, you know, the public awareness problem. I mean, is there any way to get a better handle on which of these strategies could have the most impact? And also, what's the cost of all these depreciations and these other things? I don't really see, when you sell things to the legislature, you know, there's some costs, right? So this is all good and positive, but they're going to want to know what the cost side of it is. So, and once you start getting into the cost, then people are going to ask about the cost effectiveness of these relative strategies. So those are my 2 questions.
Yeah, the which would be most effective is a really difficult topic. And I think if we were to continue the project, one thing we want to do is go back to the people that we interviewed and ask them, or say, you know, these are the accelerators we identified, can you rank them and say which ones you think would be most effective, which ones would be least effective? Because the market's so young, that makes it a little bit difficult to actually figure out what is the one main area you can target to get people to buy more ZEVs. I think for us though, just kind of working as a group, the fact that 2/3 of people don't know any zero-emission vehicle at all is particularly striking in California. And if you're talking about trying to get so many people to buy zero-emission vehicles, you need to at least have them know, first off, what a zero-emission vehicle is. In general, what we discovered was that there's a lot of incentives on the producer side, but there hasn't been a ton of incentives on the consumer side. So I think that if we were to see what could be most effective, you could maybe look at what hasn't been done yet. And on the consumer side, not a lot has been done yet, compared to on the producer side instead. There's a lot of producer incentives, there just aren't a lot of consumer incentives out there too, besides the actual financial incentives.
Right, but I mean, you know, and so part of it is incentivizing governments. I thought that one looks like it's an immediate knob that you, I mean, Joe would know better, but it seems like an immediate knob. The question would be, you know, whether they can work it into their budgets under whatever constraints come out forward. I don't know how quickly you can transform your fleets and the rest, but that would be a knob that seems to me more immediately turned.
With the California state fleet specifically, it has very, very high vehicle mileage requirements before a vehicle can be retired,
Yeah.
up to 150,000 miles actually, which is much higher than most of.
So that would have to be changed, is that right, by the legislature?
It wouldn't necessarily have to be changed, it would just have to be a factor that as your vehicle reaches the end of its life, you make the choice to switch to a ZEV. And the calculations that we did were to say that over the long term, over the long run, your maintenance of that vehicle and your ongoing costs are less than if you were to own an internal combustion engine vehicle.
And do you have an estimate on the costs of the state, any kind of ballpark idea
Yeah, we do.
of all the incentives that you have?
So for that program specifically, it ends up being a net positive by a striking amount because of the maintenance savings and the volume of vehicles that you can change out. And the initial price difference is about $14,000, just based on averages of all ZEVs and all internal combustion engine vehicles. But you save about more than $7,000 a year. So if you just estimate a 10-year life cycle for those vehicles, you're coming out quite a bit on top. And when you throw in the carbon credit, basically the reduction in carbon at 411 grams per mile, and then getting rid of those miles, replacing them with zero emissions miles, you're looking at, it's actually not nearly as substantial of savings in terms of dollars as the maintenance savings would be, but you're looking at about $500,000 worth of savings over the 10 years of the program. based on those rates.
So, so I had two questions. One was, I'm sort of surprised about the, everyone was talking about the upfront cost and not the total cost of ownership. And my impression is that most people finance their car anyway. Right? So it seems like the upfront cost shouldn't be as much of a barrier if people are financing their car over the life of a car. So I think that was something that was just sort of surprising to me. But the question I had was on the HOV lanes. So I was actually a beneficiary of getting an HOV sticker on my Prius and had it, and I used it probably 20 times over the course of 10 years. So I didn't, because I don't commute that much. But they gave me this, and it had nothing to do. It's sort of, you guys said, hey, lots of people buy the car because of this. It seems like there are huge externalities on carpools and other things that you're trying to get traffic that are negative of having somebody get this. Maybe you could think of a different plan, like you give people the opportunity to purchase an HOV sticker. And that way it addresses one of Bruce's concerns about what's the effect on the state budget of this. It may be positive if you say, look, you're allowed to buy an HOV sticker for your car for $1,000 if you buy a zero-emission vehicle. Not you get it for free or for $8 is what I had to pay. That if this is really why people are buying it, you kind of price discriminate this way and use something like that. But it does, and the other is if you have 1.5 million ZEVs on the road, the HOV lanes are going to get crowded, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So, yeah, that's obviously a really good point. The HOV lane loses its allure as it becomes more and more crowded. So,
Because the
And
goal,
we
the
do
goal
know
is
it's a temporary benefit.
Yeah.
This could not be sustained forever, obviously.
right. And
We
the goal is not. I mean, it seems odd to me though. In what your goal is to reduce carbon emissions.
Right.
So, getting more ZEVs on the road is really sort of code for getting less
That's right.
less driving by other cars.
Yes,
Right.
that's right.
Right. I mean, sort of, and you might think about what are the impacts and trying to frame it in that respect as well.
Well, another component that we didn't really talk about a lot was this idea of transforming fleets. You can also look at it in terms of transforming why people, or how people use their cars, or cut how many people are owning cars and that sort of thing, which is another, like if, for example, you were able to both get rid of cars on the road and also get, say, all the cabs and Ubers and Lyfts and everything to then become zero-emission vehicles instead, you've kind of gone in two ways, right? You've reduced emissions from the vehicles that are on the road, and you've gotten more vehicles off the road. And ultimately, several people we talked to, especially in industry, suggest that this is the track that everyone's on, is eventually start getting rid of their car and moving more towards the shared car idea instead. Then, to address your first point really quick, so actually a lot of people that buy zero-emission vehicles, the majority of them pay in cash because they tend to be quite wealthy, so they're able to pay all in cash.
Yeah, they don't.
But the other interesting thing that we found was that people don't actually do this kind of CBA that we would like to imagine that they do. A lot of people don't actually engage in looking at the total life cycle cost and ownership of the vehicle itself. They don't really take that into consideration. They spend a lot more time looking at this upfront sticker price than the savings that you get from not having to change the oil, or you're using electricity instead of gasoline. People just